Today's video is going to be a little bit different. It's not going to be talking about the game or even the rule sets, but I want to talk about a big implication of tournament brackets and what we can do to stop it. And I want to just talk about a general scenario really quick that has happened to multiple people. Let's say you are pretty sure of the general ranking of a game. You have the 1 through 8 pretty solid, or even the 1 through 16 pretty solid, right? So you generally have 1 to 16, 2 to 15, 3 to 14, etc. And then in the round after that, in a bracket, you have 1 versus 8, 2, 7, 3, 6, and 5 and 4. That's just how brackets work in general. And if you are very sure of the top 8 of a tournament, or the top 8 ranking at a particular tournament, those sets will basically always happen every single time if you are doing it incredibly accurately. However, that can lead to a lot of repetitive matches over the course of a season of Smash Bros. Ultimate, which can greatly affect the rankings. I want to use a couple people as an example, and then what I think we should do in order to fix this. For example, Nairo and Mars played 6 times, most of them in winners bracket over the course of the first PGR season, and have already played I think 2 or 3 more times, and probably have been projected to play more often than that in the current PGR season. And that is so much data for one person to have versus another person in winners quarters or in the round before that, and it's ridiculous because you don't see matchups like Nairo versus Leo, Nairo versus Tweak, Nairo versus, let's say, like Void, Nairo versus any other top player. Basically, he's always going to be running into Mars. I think he hasn't even played Dabuz other than the losers bracket at Shiny. He hasn't played him in winners bracket since, I don't even know when, since maybe Pound in April. And there have been so many events, and there are so many ways to fix this, but again, I want to use another example before that. Obviously, I know his set record very well because he's my roommate, but MVD also repetitively plays the same top players in winners bracket. It is always going to be Dabuz, or it is always going to be Mars. He has played those 2 players so many times. In this current PGR season, he has played Dabuz, I think 3 or 4 times. In the previous PGR season, he played him twice. Mars, same thing. He played him twice in winners bracket and then twice in this current season, but he hasn't really played many of the top players. He has not played Samsora, he hasn't played Tweak, he hasn't played Leo, and they're not even like projected in quarters and then he loses before. He just doesn't get a chance to play them. And again, I really don't think that's fair, because if you get brickwalled by a couple matchups or a couple players, you shouldn't have to consistently play them in tournaments, because playing against one person doesn't necessarily mean that you're worse than a bunch of the other people that would also lose to that player. I mean, hell, like Mars or Tweak or Leo, like if you're constantly running into them, at least it's like, okay, well, they're the 2 or 3 best players in the world. But there are so many times when people get brickwalled by like number 6 or number 7 and they just don't get another chance at any other top players, and it makes their season way worse because they don't have any variety, and it just looks, oh, well, they only lost to the top players they played, even though they didn't get a chance to play any of the other players. Yes, in theory, you could just upset the person that you're trying to play, but having to play them repetitively over and over again in tournaments, like week after week, or like maybe 2 weeks after 2 weeks, it just doesn't show a true representation of that player's skill. And I want to talk about what we can do and why PG stats can be the forefront of it. So as I mentioned, this only really happens when people have a very solid and very structured understanding of what they want the seeds to be. You know what 1 through 8 want to be in order exactly, but I feel like that is not a good way to go about seeding of a tournament. There needs to be brackets of skill, basically like rankings of like these players are 10 and these players are 9 and these players are 8, and then have fluidity between them to change the seeds based on the matchups that we haven't seen. And yes, could that be considered bracket fixing? I guess, if you want to throw it that way, but it's from an unbiased perspective in terms of either like a random group of seeders that we have, or the different regions can do it and just make them more solid. Or again, in my opinion, it is what something like the PG stats can do in the off season when they aren't, or I guess not off season, but when they're not actively compiling the PGR. But the PG stats can like assign a task force to seeding tournaments and making sure that the matchups that always happen don't happen. Like, we really don't need to see Nairo versus Mars for the 11th time. We don't need to see Dabuz versus MBD for the 9th time. And yes, sure, winners semis, winners finals, that's gonna happen because of the 2 best players or even the 4 best players constantly make it there. Like, I understand that being more static because it's already in top 8 and it's already, you beat everyone to get here, like whatever, that's totally fine. But in like the round of 8, the round of 16, the round of 32, we should have variability in who people play. Because if you're constantly playing only a very specific amount of people, it's not showing your skill, it's not showing, like, sure, I guess you're not adapting super hard because in theory you should be beating players, but again, they're also better than you, so if you're talking about like a skill standpoint, you should be losing to the players that are constantly seated above you, because that's just kind of how that works, but it doesn't get you to play the people on your own tier, or even different people on the same tier as the player you just keep getting brick walled by. So again, let's make a more broad example. You have 1 through 4 just completely static because those are the 4 best players. It's like Leo, Tweak, Mars, and Samsora in some order, and those are always kind of there. Then your 5 through 8 should be a little bit more fluid, and you can kind of pick and choose between them of what matchups haven't happened or aren't as common as the others, and then place them there for their seeds. 9 through 16, the same thing. If you're generally going to be seated there, you can be flowing throughout it, because honestly, realistically, it doesn't make that much of a difference whether you're 10th or 11th seed. Like, yes, it changes who you play, but you know, it's one ranking. It's not like it's like, oh, I should be 10th seed and not 11th seed. Like, if you're doing that, you're just kind of petty. And if it's something like PG stats, like, I'm all for it. Like, I've literally requested bracket changes in tournaments because I'm like, hey, I've played this person, or I've been projected to play this person 3 tournaments in a row. Can I not? Like, I know recently Pandarian has just been in my brackets forever. We played at EVO and he beat me, and he was projected to play me at SmashCon, but unfortunately he lost before he got to me. And then there was like one other tournament we were projected to play, and then the 4th time I was like, hey, me and Pandarian are projected to play again for the 4th time in like a 1.5 month span. Can you just switch one of us? Like, I really just don't want to play the same person. I'd rather lose to someone that is different than just play the same person over and over and over again, because I want variability and I want the ability to test myself versus multiple people as opposed to the same person over and over and over again, because that's not exactly testing like how true skilled you are. And honestly, if you have a more free-flowing type of like 9 through 16, you're able to change and manipulate that, and you can use the only reason I mention PG stats is because they have a record of who's playing who and how often everyone's played each other, at least in the upper echelons of the PGR, so it's easier for them to be like, oh, this matchup happens the least of all those matches. You know, Tweak has played, let's say, me less than the other like 5 through 8, so I should play Tweak as opposed to the people that have played him 4 times this season. Like, I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's just easier for PG stats to have access to that than anyone else who has to manually compile every single tournament and every single set, considering PG Stats already does that. Also, while I'm here talking about them, you might as well follow them on Twitter. They do a lot of upset threads and like the pretty graphics at the end of the event, and they're just a pretty important force, not because they're Panda Global, but just because they've just become a really reliable source of information for the scene, so go follow them. And I want to bring it to traditional sports just for a little bit, just to make a comparison. It's not the best comparison, but just in general. You have teams always have a set schedule, let's say with baseball, right? From before the season, you know who you're going to play throughout the season, and it doesn't matter how good or how bad any of your opponents are going to be, you are going to play those people because you don't want to just saturate the best versus the worst and then the second best versus the second worst, because that's just unfair. And yeah, like, the better teams in terms of like, I guess, playoffs do deserve to play the easier people because at that point they've earned it, but to me that's more like the top 8 area of like, oh, you're 1st seed and you're playing 4th seed, you deserve, because you're 1st seed and you didn't get upset, you deserve to play the weakest of that round, and I get that. But if you're playing only the best versus the worst, you're not going to have that much variability. So like, in theory, right, if I should be 5th seed, but someone puts me at 8th seed, so I have to play the 1st seed, like, it's gonna happen. It would happen the round after that if I won the 5-4 versus anyway, so it's not that big of a deal in my opinion to change those brackets, I guess manipulate the brackets, even though that sounds bad, to play matches that are less frequent and less common, because then you have a more accurate representation, you have more statistics to draw the data from, you have more data, more different data, so that you can have a more accurate representation of where players are, because suddenly I'm not just losing to number 2 over and over and over again, I'm not losing to number 4 over and over and over again. And honestly, like, I've had a pretty good spread this season because I've played Leo, Mars, Tweak, and Samsora, and a couple other top players. I haven't really played anyone in a multiple, but that's not the case for every single player. I'm just kind of getting lucky because I'm like doing really well and then really poorly, so my seed is going up and down, and it's just kind of been a ride for that. But I'm about it, and I think that should happen to more players. There should be more eyes on the brackets of tournaments to make sure that there's more variability in the sets we play. One, because like, I'm really tired of seeing Elegant and Mars for the 7th time, and I'm really tired of seeing MVD versus DeBuzz for the 9th time. I want more variability in the bracket sets just to see who would win. There's not just like, oh, well, yeah, we've seen this 7 times, so we know the outcome. It's less exciting if you've seen the same set over and over again. It's why people get less excited for Mars versus Leo than they do, let's say, Tweak versus Leo, because somehow Mars versus Leo has happened more often than Tweak versus Leo. So, and you know, obviously Leo makes those comebacks against Tweak, but in general, you know, seeing the same players play over and over again in a very small amount of time, it gets less exciting because it feels less impactful unless there's like a storyline of like, oh, this person has lost every single time and this is the one that they won. Like, that's crazy. Like, that's a pop-off, and sure, that's a cool storyline, but having to have 7 boring tournaments before that because they happen to play at 7 consecutive tournaments, because sometimes it feels like that, to get the same results just feels really long and it just drags it out, and I'm not a fan of that. So I really feel like PG Stats or something like that, like some seeding committee, can just have bigger groups of players that are like in specific groups. Like, again, 1 through 4 pretty solid, 5 through 8 fluid, 9 through 16 fluid, 17 through 32 fluid, even like 17 through 24, 25 through 32, because there's still 8 players that you can change. Like, that's a lot of a difference, especially considering you can also change who 5 through 9 are, and it would be so much better, in my opinion, if we had more variety of sets, and that is going to be through the bracket of things instead of just losers bracket. Like, the most interesting sets that I've watched in Ultimate, for the most part, are in losers bracket because they're matches that like shouldn't have happened. Like, someone gets upset and then this one player has to make a crazy losers run. Like, that's way more interesting to me than, oh, 1 seed's playing 8 seed and those have been the same players. Like, Naro and Mars have literally played like 4 winners bracket sets in the past 2 months, and I don't like that. I'd rather see them play anyone else, which is why Nairo's losers run at Shine was super exciting, because he lost to Mars in winners quarters, which is funny because that's what I'm talking about, and then he had to play, I think it was Leon and Tweak and the Buzz, and he hasn't played those players in so long, or like ever. Sometime, no, he's played all of them, but like he hasn't played them in so long, and then I think he ended up losing, he got 3rd losing to Sam Sora because he beat Mars in losers, and like, that's awesome. I really like that, because it showed like, yo, Nairo lost to Mars 7 times, and if then he like runs into like Leo because Leo's in losers bracket, then like rip, he got 9th, and then that sucks because it's like, oh well, he lost to Mars, therefore he can't be good, but then he beat Tweak and Mars again and Dabuz, which are other top players. So it shows that Nairo at the current moment is really ahead of a lot of people, even though if you had the same brackets as you always did, or if losers bracket was slightly less kind to him, you wouldn't have had that type of run, and you wouldn't have had that type of data for Nairo to prove that he's one of the best players in the world. So if you kind of understand what I'm saying, I would appreciate it. If you dropped a like and dropped a subscription to this channel, I would really appreciate it. Let me know in the comments down below what you think about it. I would greatly appreciate it, because this is a very interesting concept I came up with about a month ago, and I just haven't been able to record it since. As always, social media, Panda and Partner stuff is down below. Justice for more tournament matches and justice for Proto, and I will see you all next time.